According to the 2021 report from the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, there are close to 472 million persons with disabilities within the APAC region. Now, these numbers differ in different reports, but it is safe to say that a large proportion of disability individuals are there in the APAC region. Additionally, a global study by Skillsoft found that while 89% of people want their organization to be inclusive, to those with intellectual disabilities, only 29% expressed no concerns on hiring someone with an intellectual disability. Now, if you look at the month of December, it is a very, very important month when it comes to disability inclusion. Declared by the United Nations in 1992, December 3rd is annually observed as the International Day of Persons with Disabilities, with every year focusing on a unique theme for the International Day of Persons with Disabilities. The theme for 2022 is Transformative Solutions for Inclusive Development, the role of innovation in fueling an accessible and an equitable world. According to the Global Report on Assistive Technology, 2.5 billion people need at least one assistive product. The demand is expected to go up to 3.5 billion by the year 2050. The requirement may range from a spectacle to highly advanced myoelectric hand or robotic exoskeletons. However, nearly 9 out of 10 people who need assistive technology do not have access to it. And this has had an adverse impact on education, livelihood, health, well-being of individuals, families, communities, and societies. At Randstad Sourceright, we are gratified to support many leading organizations within the Asia-Pacific region on their hiring journeys. Randstad Sourceright's experience in driving workforce diversity helps our clients across the globe to recruit and retain candidates across age groups, ethnicities, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability status, and multicultural backgrounds. We have set ourselves an exciting ambition to become the world's most equitable and specialized talent company. Helping close the disability employment gap in APAC remains an enormous opportunity, which is why we have dedicated several webinars in our Talent Navigator series to the topic of disability inclusion. This year alone, we have done 2 of these webinars in the past, and this is the 3rd one that we're doing in the month of December. With these thoughts in mind, we are delighted to welcome all of you today to our virtual panel discussion on the theme, Prism of Possibilities, the Disability Inclusion Advantage. Let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Amit Prakash, and my pronouns are he, him, or his. I'm a part of the functional leadership team in the APAC region, leading our efforts on equity, diversity, and inclusion, and I will be your host for today. For today's webinar, I'm wearing a formal attire, which I call as a basil and cinnamon combination. I'm wearing a basil green coat, which is contrasted by a pale cinnamon full sleeve shirts within. Now, before we commence with today's virtual panel discussion, a few housekeeping items. To ensure accessible conferencing for individuals with vision and hearing impairment, this webinar has been specifically hosted on Google Meet. Please remember to mute yourselves at all time while the webinar is in progress. To enable closed captions, please click the CC button, which is there at the bottom of your screen. Joining us today is Rashida from the Singapore Association of the Deaf. Please click on the pin icon at the top of your screen to lock the presenter or the sign interpreter with us today. Rashida, can I take a moment to invite you to briefly introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Rashida. I'm the interpreter for today. I'm wearing a black top and a black tudung. Please pin me on your screen if you require sign language interpreting.
Wonderful, Rashida, and welcome to today's conversation. If you have questions, we'd love to hear them, so type them out into the chat, and we will reserve time at the tail end for the question and answer session. This webinar is being recorded, and a summary of the discussion points will be shared with all the attendees in the coming days. Now, coming to the main part of our panel discussion. I'm honored to introduce our speakers today who are joining us from India, Singapore, and Australia. My first panelist for today is Nicole Wong Dara. Nicole is a principal consultant with Get Skilled Access, a consulting organization specializing in disability and access for corporations and governments, with whom Randstad has had the privilege of working closely on two specific programs, which we will learn about in the conversation today. Nicole brings with her clinical and corporate experience together to collaborate with clients to create disability-inclusive workplaces and communities. Previously, she worked for several years at PwC Australia with a focus on D&I accessibility and preventive health and well-being, and for global law firm DLA Piper as the diversity, inclusion, and well-being lead for the Asia Pacific region. Nicole, welcome to the conversation today.
Thank you.
Nicole, would you like to describe what is the attire that you're wearing for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am wearing a black cardigan and a white t-shirt, and I have long blonde hair. I'd also just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging.
That's wonderful, Nicole. It's great to have you with us. Our second panelist for today is Stephanie Agnew. Stephanie joins us as a passionate advocate about inclusion and changing dated misconceptions of disability with a strong focus on increasing employment opportunities. Diagnosed at 19 with a degenerative eye condition, Stephanie gradually lost her vision over 10 years and is now completely blind. I'm going to be very conscious when I use this word. As a senior consultant at Get Skilled Access, Stephanie's lived experience contributes to her work with clients, providing tangible and sustainable advice to improve the inclusion experience for persons with disabilities. Stephanie, it's great to have you with us today, and welcome to the conversation.
Thank you so much. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which I am today, the Kabi Kabi and Gubbi Gubbi people, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Today I am wearing a sleeveless navy satin top, and I have blonde hair, which is in a ponytail, and white skin.
Beautiful, beautiful. Great to hear that from you, Stephanie, and welcome to the conversation once again. Our third panelist for today is Shweta Verma. Shweta is the Executive Director, Inclusion and Diversity Leader, India and APAC at PwC. She has 23 years of work experience within human capital and inclusion and diversity across diversified industries and geographies. She joined PwC in March 2004, and in the last 18 years, her focus has been on the development and implementation of the Diversity Office and strategy, expanding the scope of inclusion, people transformation strategy, work-life integration policies, enhancing employee experience and people value proposition, digitization and gamification of human capital processes, and leading global teams and projects. Shweta, we are delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here. Good afternoon and good morning, everybody. Let me take a moment to explain what I'm wearing today. I'm wearing a rust orange cardigan with a beige inner shirt. I have curls and shoulder length curls, and I'm wearing glasses as well. Thank you, and very pleased to be here.
Thank you, Shweta. We're delighted to have you with us today. Finally, let me introduce the moderator for today's panel discussion. Today's discussion will be moderated by Anthea Collier, Managing Director of Randstad Sourceright APAC. She has been responsible for quality delivery of both RPO and MSP in the Asia Pacific region since the year 2010, and fully understands the challenges and nuances of the region. Anthea is very passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Inclusive hiring practices is a particular passion for Anthea with a focus on disability inclusion. Anthea, thank you so much for being with us today and moderating the session. We are delighted to have you with us.
Thank you so much. And I am really excited about this particular webinar and indeed the series that we've had throughout the year. Let me take a moment to describe myself. I am 61 years of age. I have short blonde hair, which owes more to the chemical process than it does my natural hair, which is, I think, more grey. I am wearing a floral blue top with black pants. And I, due to my age, am also wearing glasses to help me navigate on my screen. I do want to take a moment. We as an organisation are incredibly passionate about diversity and inclusion. I had the opportunity this morning to join a year-end wrap-up town hall in Australia, and one of the proudest achievements that I heard was that we have now onboarded 5 Indigenous suppliers that will be working to support our client base. And I think we all owe it to create opportunity, equity and equality for everybody to have the right to be able to flourish and grow as individuals within the workforce. So super excited about our panel, what I know to be a passionate discussion today, and the learnings that we can take from this as we move forward. So as the moderator, I'm actually now going to turn to some questions that I'm going to ask our distinguished panel. And as they talk with you, they're going to share their experiences, their lessons learned, and their guidance for all of our curious listeners. So I'm going to start with Stephanie. What are the common misconceptions and biases that you see when it comes to disability recruitment, and what are the myths that hinder employment for people with disabilities?
So if I start with a little bit of my story, as we heard, I slowly lost my vision from the age of 19. And so before I was employed, before I lost all of my vision, and I never ever thought that I would find it hard to gain employment. But unfortunately, that has been the case. I'm lucky to be in an incredible career now and growing that. But I really suffered that unconscious bias and misconceptions around employing a person with disability. So there's lots of misconceptions around it will cost a lot of money to employ a person with disability, which we know isn't true. So often workplace adjustments can cost very little or nothing at all. I know here in Australia, there is a government body called Job Access that can fund workplace adjustments if they do cost any money. I know we are in a worldwide conversation now, so I'd encourage you to go and look at that. But for example, what I require as a workplace adjustment is a screen reader. So what that does is it reads to me everything that's on the screen. But now today, with something called universal design, there are screen readers built into most computers. So every single Apple product has a screen reader built into it. Microsoft are also doing the same thing. So for me, I can do everything that anybody else can do. There's other unconscious biases around the fact that people with disability take more sick days. I have recently, in the 3.5 years that I've worked with Get Skilled Access, I've probably only had in that whole time 7 days off on being sick. And unfortunately, 5 of those were due to COVID-19, which is fairly inevitable. So that is another myth. There's another myth around that people with disability can only do unskilled work. For me, I really want a career. I have a passion. I know so many people with disability that have degrees that are very, very smart. We're great problem solvers. We have to think about how to solve these problems every single day in our life to navigate. I need to work out how I'm going to do things differently. So I bring that to the workplace. I bring innovation to the workplace. There's so many misconceptions and unconscious bias, but ultimately what we need to remember is that people with disability are people first. And to be curious, so lead with empathy and lead with curiosity and ask questions. We know our disability best. So I want to turn up to an interview and be assessed on my skills and everything that I'm bringing to that job. And then at the end say, okay, Steph, are there any workplace adjustments that you require? How can we best support you to be yourself? I want to be seen as a person first, and all of the skills that I bring, and my disability is last.
That is beautifully articulated, Stephanie. Thank you so much. I'm just going to ask Shweta the same question. Shweta, what do you think are the common misconceptions and biases when it comes to disability recruitment? Can you talk to us a little bit about the journey that PwC is on?
Sure, Anthea. And while Stephanie has kind of articulated her lived experience and what she faces, I'm going to share the organizational perspective and how people really look at from the other side of the table. Well, you're right. I think there is a lot of biases that exist in the employment or the organization or the workplaces today. And when I look at the India work environment or the where we kind of work, we have a law, which is the rights for persons with disability, which really asks the organization to create policies that do not discriminate persons with any kind of disability. But unfortunately, I think this is a journey that we are on and it will take a while. But when we look at our internal, when we review our processes and when we look at our people, there are various biases that do hamper, the working or our decision making. And I think, as Stephanie said, unconscious bias, being ignorant, is the biggest one, is what I feel. Our implicit biases are basically because the way we have seen our environment, the way we have grown, our experiences, our education, and this marginalized community was never, I think, historically has never been at par or has not been, I've never, if I recollect, not seen anybody who's differently able studying with me. So I think those experiences have kind of been, over the years, have been built up so much that comes to impact the way we work. And therefore, I think it's about how do we challenge these biases? How do we create that education and ignore, to shake these ignorances that exist? How do we educate our people? So I think there are a lot of things in PwC that we are looking at. And let me acknowledge and articulate that PwC is not a very mature, India and APAC are not very mature organizations when it comes to our journey on persons with disability. We've just embarked on this journey, and it will be a point where we are only learning every day. So I think we are looking at it in a whole spectrum of embedding this inclusion angle to every side of our, every aspect of our talent cycle. So when we look at recruitment, we have taken several steps, and maybe during the course of the panel, I will explain them. But I think the first and the foremost is the leadership commitment. We have a disability strategy that we have kind of, created, and that focuses on 6 pillars. And on first is, of course, the leadership commitment, talent and representation. So how do we increase the representation of persons with disability, building that culture of education, awareness, shaking those ignorances that exist, that, as Stephanie said, that they require a lot of sick leaves, they need a lot of accessibility or assistive devices. So I think those kind of ignorances need to be challenged. How do you interview persons with disability? That know-how. What is the kind of language that you use to address? How do you kind of not say, I always say this, disability is not inability. How do you challenge that? So I think these are some of the things that we look at when we build culture of awareness. And we are doing several efforts, like not only sessions, but it's about campaigns, communication, sharing some one-pager guidelines with our people which can be easily accessed by them. Then, of course, our adjustments and supports that are needed. So understanding really the needs of our people. And then accessibility, assistive devices, our infrastructure. And then the last is, of course, the data and self-identification. We do want to kind of leverage our data, our engagement scores, to say that how do we build on them? How do we really ensure that we encourage people to feel comfortable in that environment, that PwC is a safe space and you can come and identify yourself to a person who really is a person who is differently abled and needs support, for us to be able to build that. So I think these are some of the things that we are doing, but maybe I totally agree there are biases, and we all need, as organizations, we really need to work towards making those efforts and putting in policies and processes.
Thank you, Shweta. While we're still with you, I think what I'm hearing you say, and we discussed this a little yesterday as we prepared, is that PwC is focused on building the right culture first before you address the recruitment piece. Would that be correct?
Absolutely. I think we really acknowledge that we will not, if we fix targets today and just put in the numbers and say that we are going to hire persons with disability in whichever roles, whichever departments, and we may be hiring them even in back office or administrative roles or even in our housekeeping, and we've done it. We don't want to pat our backs by saying this or by doing this. What we really want to do is we want to provide employability to everybody, to be able to provide a respectable work environment, and say that we will build the foundation in the next 1 or 2 years to say that we will educate our people, we will educate our hiring managers, we will put in, like we have started on this, we've gotten special consultants who are experts in the market, who are going to be, supporting us in hiring persons with disability. We're looking at models where we hire and train people for specific jobs. We're looking at people, how can they help, like if they're autistic, can we use them for our coding work if we have in one of the functions? So we are looking at identifying that are roles that really work or fit in with people with different kind of disabilities that they have, to be able to provide them a meaningful work life. And just not about, taking in targets and, just ensuring that we get the numbers. So you're right that we are in that stage where we are building that culture of education, awareness, bringing people in this decision making. It's not something that comes from top and we ask somebody to just implement this. You go ahead and hire 10 in your team or 20 in your team. It's about including everybody and saying that we want to make this place a truly inclusive one. So how do we do it? So, and of course the first step is also we are creating an ability network.
Yeah.
Provide that safe space.
I think that's very important. Aparna, thank you for your question. I'm going to circle back to you momentarily. We support some amazing clients, and the focus has been very much on gender. And now our clients are starting to look on how they can move towards supporting disability. But what we do see is that as fast as we're onboarding gender hires, we see a higher attrition in those gender hires. And so the key is being able to look at the culture and creating an inclusive culture that supports those individuals and changes some of the structural barriers to successful employment. I think the two have to work hand in hand, or as you're doing better, making sure that the culture supports those hires before we actually start moving forward. Otherwise, it's not successful if you're achieving certain KPIs at the hiring level, but you're not retaining them because you're not enriching that particular culture. And that is very important. A quick question now coming into Nicole and then Stephanie. Randstad has had the benefit of working closely with Get Skilled Access in Australia on a number of programs. Can you each speak to the joint collaboration in employing and supporting persons with disabilities in the workforce? Can I go to you first, Nicole? And could you talk a little bit about DISA for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So we were very fortunate to work with Randstad on this particular project. DISA, which is the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources, say that fast 10 times. It was really committed to their employment target. They had an employment target of 10% of people with disability in their organisation by 2025. In order to do that, they wanted to put into place an affirmative action measure. They knew that their current hiring processes weren't going to get them there. So in order to achieve this, they really needed to look at pushing the agenda forward. To do that, they earmarked 20 roles, which is quite significant in any one organisation, to earmark 20 roles specifically targeted for the employment of people with disability. As part of that process, they looked at their employee value proposition, they looked at their recruitment processes and practices, and we, with GSA along the way, consulted with them at each step of those to make sure that language was inclusive, that there weren't any unintentional barriers throughout the recruitment process, that their hiring managers and their recruitment teams were trained So that way, when they were going through that recruitment process, people with disability felt comfortable and confident that the people that they were talking to were going to be able to, you know, kind of handle any questions and needs. And also those recruiters felt comfortable in those conversations and to be able to ask and not assume and interact with people with disability and provide those required adjustments as needed. So I think one of the major successes of this project is that once the roles were advertised, there was, I think, over 200 applications for just those 20 roles. So we know the talent is out there. It's not a matter of, there is no people with disability, we can't find the talent. The talent is out there. And that in particular, just going through a process whereby it was inclusive, there was symbolic action taken to target talent with disability, meant that people were more comfortable to come through the process, disclose and be successfully recruited as part of it.
And I think, Stephanie speaking, I think, Nicole, to add to that, the big thing for me that I was really excited about with the DISA project is those 20 roles were not just entry-level roles. There were some really senior roles, really specific roles in science and technology, and we had those people with disability with those kind of skills. So it was really, really great that we had such a broad range of roles available.
And I think that's a great point to make, because we often hear employers saying we can't find talent, but it's because they're looking for talent in a very, very narrow silo. And if we thought more broadly and removed those hurdles and those biases, those unconscious biases, the talent exists. In a conversation with Stephanie yesterday, she was telling us that it took her 2 years to find a job. And look what a capable, engaging individual she is. Yet she was automatically excluded from a lot of opportunities because, she is blind. But that with technology today, and even without the technology, it's not a hurdle. So we just need to change our mindset. Can I ask you to talk a little bit about Recruitable?
Yeah. So Recruitable is my absolute passion project, and it actually came from exactly what you're talking about around the 2 years of me trying to get a job. So GSA partnered with Randstad to create a pilot program to make the mainstream recruitment process and industry in Australia accessible for people with disability. So in those 2 years, I chose not to go through what we call in Australia a disability employment service. They weren't right for me, and I wanted to go through mainstream recruitment just like everybody else. But I came up against many, many barriers, and so do a lot of people with disability, from the unconscious bias to the technological barriers in websites not being accessible or applications not being accessible. So Randstad and ourselves at Get Skilled Access created a pilot program and called it Recruitable. And what it is Randstad are the recruiter, and all of their recruiters have gone through training that we have developed around employing people and interviewing, sourcing people with disability. And we've brought on, at the beginning of it, 7 different organisations. There's some small and medium organisations and also large organisations all across Australia who have signed on to Recruitable. And they've committed to giving us between 3 and 7 roles each. And those roles, again, similar to DISA, are a range of entry level up to senior position level roles. But before they employ those people through Randstad, they come to Get Skilled Access, and we do a number of initiatives. We heard earlier around how important it is for an inclusive culture to be able to retain employees with disability and to be able to help us to thrive. So we go in and we do what we call a recruitment review. So we do an end-to-end review of all of the internal organisation recruitment processes, and we identify where they're doing things really well and where there's opportunities for inclusion and accessibility. So where there might be barriers in their language or on their websites, their application forms, their procedures and their processes, and we provide them with a report, and they get those recommendations to slowly work through. We then do an inclusive culture health check. So we do a survey and focus groups with the current employees at the organisation, and we're able to identify where that organisation is in regards to their inclusive culture to do with disability, and we also give them recommendations. We also do a number of face-to-face training sessions with the executive team because we know that change needs to come from the top down for it to be sustainable. And we also do training sessions with the hiring managers because ultimately, whilst Randstad sources and does the first interviews as a recruiter, the hiring managers will then do the final interviews and the onboarding. So we do training for them. We then have a full online suite of online training additional to the hiring managers. And then finally, there's training for the team that the person with disability is going to be hired in. And we call that the inclusive teammates training because, again, it comes down to that inclusive culture. And so those sorts of things are around the language of disability, including people understanding that a person with disability is first. So we're touching all levels of the business and doing that real overall review before we're hiring the roles into the organisations. And excitedly, we've now hired 4 of those roles. And there's been a big push. We've just advertised another 7 roles today through Coles. So Coles, for those who are not in Australia, is one of the largest supermarkets in Australia, and they're hiring specifically into their IT department. So not into stores, into their IT department. So they've just released 7 roles. We have a really broad range of organisations that are involved, and it's really, really exciting.
Fantastic. I'm going to share some of the questions that are coming in from the chat that are stimulated by this discussion. For those roles that where we're hiring for PwD, are we calling out specifically that those roles are only for PwD? So for instance, for DISA, was it made very clear that it was only individuals with disability that could apply?
Yes.
Yeah, for DISA, it was an affirmative action approach and it was targeted recruitment for people with disability. So yeah, absolutely for DISA, yeah. Steph can talk to the recruitable because that's slightly different.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so recruitable is also affirmative measures, but what we needed to do with that is legally in Australia, you need permission to be able to have affirmative measures, or some people call it positive discrimination. So we needed to go through a process and get approval for that. But whilst those roles are specifically just for people with disability, there's a whole nother piece, if I put my consulting hat on, around inclusion statements on all job ads. So, what is your inclusion statement saying? We encourage people with disability, we encourage Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to apply, but why? What are you doing? We understand the benefits. We want you to come and work for us, and making sure often we see those inclusion statements at the bottom of a job ad, but it's important that we move it to the top, because sometimes when we have it at the bottom of a job ad, it can seem a little bit tokenistic. And as a person with disability, if I'm reading through a job ad and it's starting to sound really non-inclusive and not like me, I'm probably not going to get to the end of the job ad to read that inclusion statement. So if that's one of the first things that I read, that's going to call me in and go, oh, wow, this organisation is committed to inclusion. Maybe this could be for me.
Some sage advice there. Thank you, Stephanie. Shweta, I think it's Aparna is saying that a lot of disability is invisible. Any thoughts on how you would deal with people who are already hired?
So totally, I think there are visible disabilities and invisible, and I think it's the people who have invisible disabilities that really need that comfort space and safe space to be able, and I'm not taking away that people with physical disabilities don't need, but I think it is also about, and I say that when you educate people, when you create or build that culture of awareness, it is just not about, only about accommodation or assistive devices that may be needed for persons who have physical disabilities, but also about the mental well-being. It is also about how do you create that awareness and education about, invisible disabilities within the team. I also do believe that at some time, while the organization will do their bit, it is also how individuals who have those disabilities create that group where, or build that trust within their teams to be able to share that they have this, and they need that environment or comforting space and to kind of help them be productive. I do feel that at some point we shy away from seeking help, to say that, to raise the hand and say that, I may have a few days which I may not be giving my 100%, which is fine. Don't shy away from doing that. I just think that the organization's attitude to visible and invisible may not be hugely different, because we'd want to support all our employees without any bias or without any discrimination. But it is about, how do you kind of seek that help and ask for it? When I look at PwC 5 years back, before COVID, we never spoke about mental well-being. We never had, counselors, or we never had any sessions or panels or coaches who could support us or our people on that journey. But post-COVID, I think the realization is very, very on our face, and everybody has realized, whether somebody had invisible disability prior to COVID, I think we've all been challenged in that space, irrespective, after COVID. So we all need help at various junctures of our life. And it may, I may be going through a particular phase in my life, and I may be going through a depression. So I think it's about how you seek help as well. So I think it's the joint ownership that needs to come there. That's what I think. I don't think so that the organizations should be able or can do anything which is different unless they don't know.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
And I think just maybe to add to Shweta, sorry, just to add to Shweta's point, that creation of psychological safety is really key. And in particular for people with invisible disability, it may be throughout their careers they don't need anything. But one of the key things that we tell all of our clients is, if you can create a space and a process for someone to ask at any point throughout, whether it's at the job recruitment phase, all the way through to potentially when they're exiting an organisation, at any given point in their career, to ask for whatever adjustments they require. And there's a process and a procedure, and it's well known, and the culture is promoting that. That in itself, regardless of whether it's a visible or invisible disability, enables someone to access the support and the tools and the resources that they need to be able to thrive in their career.
Awesome. And Nicole, I was coming to you on the question from Neelam. What about ASD spectrum people? Is there any specific way to determine roles?
Well, yeah, I mean, I can see Steph chomping at the bit for this one, but we at GSA do say that anybody can do any role. So it isn't about identifying particular roles for particular types of disability or for particular types of people. A truly inclusive organisation, anyone can do any role, and it's about the skills, experience, and attributes that individual brings to the role, as to whether or not they're the best fit.
Thank you.
You can add to that if you want, Steph.
No, I was going to say something similar. So we don't create roles specific for people with disability. It's a role, and a person with disability can do it. But it's about looking at what are the actual key requirements of the role, and then what else can be adjusted. So, for example, I used to work in real estate. I worked in real estate for 11 years, and a key requirement of the role used to be that you needed a driver's license because you needed to be able to drive around. But the adjustment that we were able to make for me to continue my role in real estate was a couple of different things. So I was then, can I catch public transport, or am I allowed to have my own driver, or could somebody else go out and do those inspections for me? So what are the small adjustments to that role, or reasonable adjustments to that role that could be made to suit that candidate if that candidate is the right person?
Yeah, I can understand where that question is coming from, because we have clients saying to us that they want us to run a campaign for autistic individuals that will be doing business intelligence type work, so analytics. I think there's there's thoughts around streaming from that perspective, which seems to be gaining some degree of momentum. But to the point, it's really about making accommodations so that anybody is able to be considered for a role regardless of the specifics of their disability.
Yeah.
Shweta, I think this is a question for you, again from Aparna here, wanting to understand if there's any aspect of looking at intentional intersectionality while hiring PwDs. So for instance, how many of the PwD hired are women?
So let me be honest, and I did say that, you know, when you look at PwC, we are only initiating, or we are at the very early stages of our hiring, or if I can say our journey on persons with disability. But clearly, I think when you look at other spectrum of diversity, there is the intentional intersectionality that is looked at, whether it's in the LGBTQ or whether it is in disability space. And I'm sure that there are, when we speak of reasonable accommodation, or when we look at various policies, they are crafted in that manner to make sure that we are inclusive in every way. So at this particular point of time, I don't think so. In PwC, we have specifically kind of in our PwD hiring considered this. But as we go along and as we get to a point of maturity, I'm sure we will be doing this as well.
Thank you. Nicole, how can organisations strengthen measures of inclusion and accountability so that momentum is sustained long after a disability inclusion strategy goes into implementation?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question, and it's something that we at GSA are incredibly passionate about and conscious of. You know, we're a consulting organisation. We tend to get, you know, come in at a moment in time and then move on, and the client is left to, you know, continue that implementation. One of the key things that we advise is whatever we put into place, it needs to be embedded in systems and processes that already exist in the organisation, or adapting existing systems and processes to be more inclusive. I think when change is seen as overwhelming or an additional, you know, piece on somebody else's role, it becomes burdensome, and often is the thing that will fall off when the person who is watching or the person who is trying to implement leaves or disappears. So making sure that that is embedded in current systems and processes, that you're reducing barriers within mainstream recruitment practices or within mainstream, you know, practices across the board, and not having a specific program to bring people with disability in, and that's the only way that people with disability get into the organisation, I think is really key. Because once a process is inclusive for people with disability, it's likely going to be inclusive for everybody. Another piece is making sure that you have representation at all levels, and by that it means that people with disability aren't just being brought into those entry-level roles. It's, you know, how do you make sure that people with disability within your workplace are progressing through the organisation? They've got the opportunity to work at, you know, across all levels of the organisation, and hopefully, you know, within your leadership as well. That in itself is a way to create sustainable cultural change. The narrative there is really about, you know, again, going back to that, all roles for all people. People with disability are not just earmarked and put in, you know, this particular program and just brought in one section. It's across all the organisation. I think another piece that there also is leading from the top, which was mentioned earlier, and a bit of a consistency around the communication and messaging, making sure that it's not just a one and done approach, or that it's not a, you know, oh, we built a strategy and we did that last year. It's a consistency of messaging, you know, around the inclusion and commitment, and that.
Cash, who's a member of Randstad, has posted a question, which is a great one. As I talk with clients, I often see leadership who are driving, but then when you get to the mid-level of the organisation, the hiring managers are very focused on getting the job done in the fastest way possible with the shortest ramp. He asks, should the performance metrics for a person be the same as for others, for, you know, a PwD? How do we gauge the right performance metrics so a person doesn't feel undervalued or overstressed? Any thoughts there?
For me, it comes back down to the key requirements. Actually, let me take one step back. So you've got the buy-in from the exec, but then maybe not hiring managers. So I think when you're meeting with your clients and meeting with those hiring managers, it's around having the conversations from the very beginning around inclusion and disability inclusion and the benefits that employing people with disability can bring to their team. And then to your question around the metrics, it's around those key requirements. So we've recently, especially through Recruitable, been talking about how do we make those metrics accessible for a person with disability. So, for example, there was a group intake through a client of ours, and the activity was a Lego activity. So some in Australia may use the activity. It's a Lego activity. You have to pair up with people and you've got to build the Lego, and then the other person has to read out the instructions, and it's all around communication. But there have been a number of barriers in that activity for people who are blind or low vision or people with low dexterity. But it's around going, okay, what is that exercise or what is that metric that we're actually needing to measure? And what kind of adjustment can we make to that to then measure that? So what's another way that we can measure the communication? There's a survival exercise that is sort of just a verbal one that may be more accessible and may be more inclusive to a lot of people. So for me, it's all around those key requirements. We're not saying employ a person with disability that doesn't have the skills, but really getting those key requirements, the key metrics, and then working out, okay, so for me, a typing test is probably not going to be exactly great because I need to listen to the words that's being read from my screen reader, and then I need to type it out. So that's going to take me double the time. So an adjustment for that to maybe test me for my typing skills might be somebody standing next to me and reading it aloud, so I don't need to try and navigate my screen reader and type at the same time. So those kind of little adjustments to work out how to get those key metrics. Nick, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think it's a challenge that we come up against a lot, and I think that executive support is as important as everybody being on board. What we tend to find the biggest push is, particularly at that hiring manager level or the decision maker at the end of the day, the ones who are deciding to give the roles, is that it feels easier to bring someone in that I know is going to be able to hit the ground running. There is often a fear that there's a fear of difference, whether it's disability, whether it's any kind of diversity group, bringing someone in whose CV looks a little bit different, whose background looks a little bit different. I think having people understand the importance of diversity, building that business case, and really, driving home the fact that, yes, this individual may look and feel different. It doesn't mean that the outcome of what they deliver is going to be different. How they get there might be, but the outcome, and that's what you're really looking for, is can this person achieve the outcomes of the role? Can this person, deliver, to Steph's point, the inherent requirements of the role? Doesn't matter how they get there. And the doesn't matter how they get there is usually answered with probably not.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Shweta, yes, please.
And can I just add this to this conversation? I think when you look at organizations which are large, and when we are reviewing our performance matrix, even from a woman who has returned from maternity, the team leaders are always in that. There is no right answer that has been cracked till now by the organization on how do you assess women for that period when they were not there. Right. And so there is this bias that exists when people are assessing people. And as Stephanie said, that we are hiring people for competence and skills and the job that's being done on the, or their output or outcomes that they're achieving. So it's purely very objective assessment that people really need to look at some point. And moderations here and there are always made, but they are not articulated for each one of us. It's not that all of us or anybody has always an upswing and you're performing to the T throughout those 12 months. I mean, there may be a phase where you were unwell, there may be a phase where you kind of had a different experience. So I think that it's no different for persons with disability, but it is just being that empathetic, that that inclusive leader, and playing that, doing that performance management review or a conversation.
Thank you, Shweta. Moving quickly to culture, so you're preparing PwC to move down this particular path. You're anticipating it's going to take a year. Are you looking at using virtual learning sessions to sensitize the workforce and leadership towards being more inclusive? How do you plan to drive that change?
So in PwC, there are several things that we are doing, and we are looking at several modes. We are leveraging virtual learning. There is absolutely no denial about that. What we have done is we have sessions, like we start with onboarding and educating our people just on our inclusion and diversity journey, and increasingly we have baked in disability inclusion as a section in our onboarding education. I think we are one of the organizations, or maybe a pioneer, where we have and in India, we've made this mandatory. We call it inclusive mindset learning pathway. And this is a 10-hour learning pathway that we have globally across PwC. And in India, we've made it mandatory for everybody to kind of go through this, and they can pace it according to their own convenience and go through it. And there are modules of disability inclusion. There is YouTubes. There is that group discussion that is kind of facilitated via this learning pathway. So, and we bring people in the room to kind of discuss on how do you hire, in smaller groups, we are bringing in people to discuss how do you hire persons with disability? How do you interview? If somebody comes and articulates that I have this kind of an invisible disability, then how do you react? How do you look at things differently, or you continue? So we are looking at various means. And then there is that really optics that we are using. So campaigns, communication, the screensavers. We have our In Focus magazine, internal magazine. So we are leveraging all forums to create that awareness. Our chairman, whenever he's now speaking in our town halls, he started saying that disability inclusion is a key focus for us. I'm also on the journey of identifying a disability inclusion sponsor for PwC. So I think these are some of the ways that we are really looking at building that culture. And I think one of the things that we are now starting is to showcase success stories of our persons with disability. Bringing them in a conversation like this, a panel discussion like this with 2 members or 3 members, to one, share their lived experience. Second, what are things that have worked with them in the last many years that they have worked with the organization or their early experiences, and what has really not worked. I think these are some of the ways we are encouraging conversations. We are encouraging that learning within PwC.
Thank you so much. I can't believe it, but we're almost 5 minutes to the conclusion. I'm going to ask one final question. I know that I myself am always nervous that I might use the wrong language. What would you suggest as the right words or images to talk about and represent people with disabilities to make sure that we are inclusive in our language? How would you guide us in terms of how we engage? Shall I start with you, Stephanie?
Sure. So there can be a lot of fear around disability and saying the wrong thing, and also around different cultures. But for me, saying nothing at all is actually worse than saying the wrong thing, because often people will potentially ignore me, or I wouldn't get an interview, or those sorts of things because of the fear. So I would rather, as long as you're coming from a good place, I understand, and people with disability understand that you're all on different levels. Being educated, so there's a lot of education around language, so not using outdated terms. So we often say outdated terms like crazy or mental or those sorts of things should not be used anymore. You try a person who has mental ill health or those sorts of things. About looking at a person first. With images, for me, it's about authentic images. You can tell when they're sort of stock images and it's not being authentic. So I think it's about being authentic and acknowledging where you are. Like, you don't need to advertise we're perfectly inclusive. You know, you can put on your websites or on your recruitment, you know, this is what we're doing, this is what we're working towards. And that, to me, as a person with disability, is a sign and symbol of inclusion. You know, it's an ever-changing journey. Language is ever-changing. You know, things are changing in every single different diversity group, and so it's ever evolving. But if I can see what an organisation is aiming towards, that's a lot better for me than saying nothing at all. I'm not sure if anyone else wants to sort of add a little bit to that.
Nicole, anything to add, or Shweta?
Yeah, I mean, I would probably just echo Steph in that ask, don't assume. I mean, I think when you're interacting with someone with disability, you know, politely asking, you know, what they need, or if they require help, or do they prefer person first language, or do they prefer identity first language? Asking those questions in a kind, considerate and empathic way is surely going to be better than just avoiding the person. What we notice the most is fear creates inaction, and that inaction is how change does not happen. So yeah, the more we can ask and don't assume, the better.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, likewise, I think.
Go ahead.
Likewise, I think it's absolutely ask, don't assume, and it's the same thing that, you know, you wouldn't go out when if it's in a group like this, you wouldn't go out, introducing somebody with their disability. You wouldn't like to do that, right? So I think just avoid all of these creating awkward situation. Be respectful in every way as you would be with other colleagues. That's it.
Thank you. Miracle, thank you for your question. We've only got 30 seconds left, but what I'm thinking is we could connect you with Amith, who leads our ED&I practice, and he could connect with you and help answer your question, if that's all right with you. Amith, do you want to close us out?
Yes, Anthea, thank you so much. And I think I would like to first acknowledge the fact that this has been a very, very deep dive discussion on disability inclusion. I would like to acknowledge the points which were brought out by the panelists, and also all the questions which the participants had put in. I think a lot of participants who come in for this conversation are diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioners, and their questions really resonated in terms of the kind of work that they are doing within their organization or their own learning for disability inclusion. So a big thank you to all the panelists, to Shweta, to Nicole, to Stephanie for being with us today. I think your insights added a lot of value to the focus and the efforts that we have on disability inclusion. I'd also like to acknowledge Anthea's involvement as the moderator. Anthea, thank you so much for those thought-provoking questions. It's very, very important that we, pick the questions which can really, create the conversation and the difference that we want to bring for disability inclusion. Rashida, thank you so much for being our sign language interpreter. I know you've been, interpreting the entire conversation nonstop. So a big, big thank you. And let me also acknowledge that while we put this entire event together, there are a lot of individuals who worked behind the scene to bring this all together. So a big, big thank you to them. To all the participants, let me also reiterate that you will be getting a copy of the recording and also a brief that will be shared with you. So just hold on to that. It'll come to your mailbox. And let me not forget that this is just the starting point. There's a lot of more conversations around disability, around diversity and inclusion that we intend to have. On that note, Anthea, Shweta, Nicole, Stephanie, and all the teams, all the participants, a big thank you for joining us today. Let me end by wishing all of you a very happy New Year, happy holidays, and we look forward to connecting with you very, very soon. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.